Over the last 15 years, entertainment has evolved beyond TV and movies. Streamers and studios are facing the challenge of attracting and retaining younger generations of viewers. Let's face it, they've grown up connected to smartphones, social media, and video games. To understand where we started and where we're headed, I sat down with Joel Tator. He's a producer and pioneer in intimate, direct-to-audience entertainment. Joel helped to create one of the most groundbreaking talk shows in America.
To get a sense of how we got to where we are today, I met up with Joel near his home in downtown Los Angeles and took a trip down memory lane.
So Joel, talk about this picture.
Yeah, we had asked the Tennessee State Prison if we could interview James Earl Ray, and they said yes, surprisingly. And so we went and set up in his little mini cell there. And of course, he denied that he had shot Dr. King. But the interesting thing was that after we left his cell, a number of the prisoners there had taken the opportunity to decide that they were going to have a boycott against the prison. And since we were there with a television crew, what a great opportunity for them to get their stories on the air. And they wouldn't let us out, and the warden suggested that we not try to get out unless we interviewed all the prisoners about their grievances. And so quite unexpectedly, we wound up with another 1-hour show that we weren't planning on because of the prisoners at Tennessee State Penitentiary.
Wow.
Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense. What was he like? What was
Well, you know, he came in. We had arranged to find out what his favorite wine was, and we got a bottle of his wine, which you see here. And we wanted to use clips from some of his movies, but unfortunately, we were not a news program. We were an entertainment program. And so the clips that they wanted to charge us were so expensive that we simply had to play music from his movies. We couldn't use the clips. But he was a lovely person. He liked Tom. Tom liked him.
Joel Tator's life can be seen as one of innovation and creativity. With a career as a director and producer spanning 3 decades, he's rubbed shoulders with some of the entertainment and news world's biggest names. Working alongside renowned host Tom Snyder, Joel pioneered American late-night television. We've come to his home to learn the story of how the media we all consume began to change.
So we're here today, but let's talk a little bit about tomorrow.
Yes.
The Tomorrow Show. I had a professor in college who said, you know, when it comes to editorial, plagiarism's a thing, but when it comes to production, plagiarism isn't a thing because everything's been done before. But in your case, that's not the case because you were kind of in uncharted territory. It was like you had a canvas, you could create whatever you wanted. Talk to me about that because many people don't get that opportunity in this business.
Well, it's interesting how it all happened. In 1972, the FCC said no more cigarette advertising on television. And of course, they were spending millions of dollars on shows. I Love Lucy was sponsored by a cigarette company. So the networks were losing all this revenue, and they didn't know what they could do about it. And a very bright person at NBC sat down at the table and he said, let's extend the broadcast day. Let's, instead of signing off at 1 a.m. after the Tonight Show, let's go to 2 a.m. And everybody said, yeah, let's do that. And so they decided that they didn't want to spend a lot of money, but that they were going to do a show from 1 to 2, and the cheapest thing they could do would be an interview show. So that's how it came about. It was strictly because of the cigarette advertising.
And then how did you become associated with it?
Well, let's talk about how Tom got picked. The NBC vice president who was charged with taking control of the Tomorrow Show and shepherding it was a guy named Mort Werner. Mort Werner was the first producer of the Today Show back in 1952. He also was the one who hired Steve Allen to do the Tonight Show. He was also the one who hired Johnny Carson to do the Tonight Show. So this one particular day, he'd been across the country. He was dead tired. He checked into his hotel in LA and fell asleep. But before he fell asleep, he turned on the set, fell asleep. When he woke up, there was Tom Snyder doing the 6 o'clock news on Channel 4. And he looked for a second and he said, that's my guy. Didn't know Tom, didn't know anything about him. He said, that's my guy. I was directing Tom on that newscast. And he called me into the office one day and he said, guess what? I'm going to get this late night show that they're doing. I said, really? He said, yeah, it's going to be tomorrow's show. And he said, I'd like you to direct it. And I said, oh, that'd be great. He said, it's going to be on from 1 to 2 in the morning. And I thought, no way is this ever going to work. I mean, who's going to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning? So I thanked him and I felt, you know, I had to take the job, but I thought 13 weeks tops.
Joel assumed he'd be in a short-term gig. What he hadn't anticipated was the changing landscape of America's television habits. Handed a blank slate in an era of television's Wild West, Joel and his team got to work. And with a nightly audience of more than 5 million, The Tomorrow Show was able to attract some of the biggest names in the industry.
This one here, Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, I did a number of things with Jimmy Stewart. He had a charity run through Griffith Park that he did every year to raise money. And Channel 2, where I worked, wanted to make a special out of the race, and so we did that. And I was totally intimidated. Celebrities totally intimidate me, and I had to have him read a piece of script that I had written. And we were in a recording booth about this size, and he read it once, and he said, oh, was that all right? I'd be happy to do it again. And I'm thinking, I'm telling Jimmy Stewart how to read a line? What's the matter with me? And I said, no, it was fine. It was wonderful.
And then this picture we'll close with.
Yes, we did tour the town in China. We were there for a week, and it was a terrific experience. And we got some great shows out of it, and I really enjoyed being there.
We continue now with Alfred Hitchcock, the motion picture director.
The Tomorrow Show gained its notoriety from the intimacy it offered viewers. Celebrity guests were drawn to the show, which allowed them a less scripted platform to speak their minds.
The show had an intimacy that was not common for talk shows back then, because you had an audience and then the people would be on for about 5 minutes. There'd be the laughs, the applause. You guys just broke the convention altogether.
There was no band. There was no studio audience. It was Tom and a guest, and we wanted it to be just that way, one-on-one, Tom and the viewer. And that's why we used a lot of close-ups, and because we just wanted it to be a conversation between Tom, whoever his guest was, and the viewers. Now, sometimes the top of the show for the first 8 or 9 minutes, he just talked to the camera, to the people at home, and it was very intimate. And people felt he was talking to them, which is the best thing you can ask for a talk show. The reason that show worked with so many people is because it was like you and I are talking right now. It was that way.
And some guests came on that show that might not want to go on other shows because they knew that they could. I mean, I think of John Lennon as one example. Yes. You know that you're going to get some amount of time to actually talk about a specific issue that Tom's going to give you that time.
Right. And there were no gotcha questions. It was a conversation. Now, the reason, first of all, you need to know that NBC was very protective of The Tonight Show because that was the big moneymaker. And so before any guest, a celebrity or not a celebrity, appeared on The Tomorrow Show, they had to be cleared by one of the network vice presidents, so as not to offend Johnny. In other words, they would make the decision, well, Johnny wouldn't use this guest. Johnny wouldn't do this topic. Then we could have that person. The reason we got John Lennon was he wanted to come on and specifically talk about his legal case against the United States government. They were going to throw him out of the country for marijuana use. And he was going to bring his lawyer on, and they were going to talk about marijuana. So when we submitted his name, we said that he was going to talk about that. Now, Johnny would never do that kind of a serious show about marijuana, and certainly wouldn't give anybody 60 minutes. So that's the reason they let John Lennon on. John Lennon was one of the biggest names we had, but it was because he was. Now, as it turned out, the first 10 minutes of the show was about marijuana, and then 50 minutes of Beatles, which is fine. You knew it was gonna go that way. When Marlon Brando was on, he was there to talk about Native Americans and the way they were being portrayed and their problems, and that's how we got him on the show. And the first 10 minutes was about that, and then we went into The Godfather and everything else. But that's how it was.
It was this editorial freedom that made The Tomorrow Show unique in its time. It was also what made both guests and viewers love the show. Some celebrities, however, tried to push the envelope too far for what the era would permit.
After the Lennon show, I got a call from the agent for George Carlin. And he said that George had seen the show with John Lennon and wanted to come on the Tomorrow Show to talk about the fact that when Carlin is on stage, he's high on marijuana. And the NBC vice president who cleared the guest said, you can have George Carlin come on and talk about that, but I will guarantee you he will be blackballed, not only from NBC, he will be blackballed on all 3 networks. He will never appear on television again if you do that. If you want that on your conscience, book him. Well, I did not want that on my conscience, really. I mean, it would have been a great show, but I didn't want to be the vehicle where George Carlin was blacklisted on television. So he didn't do the show. A month later, he was the first host of Saturday Night Live.
Wow. Wow. So you saved his career.
I'd like to think I saved his career. Yeah. He never thanked me, but that's fine.
You know, the interesting thing about Tom Snyder, though, is he gets this job and he's a newscaster. You don't know what kind of interviewer he's going to be. Right. But he was a very skilled interviewer, wasn't he? I mean, and that's not to say that you didn't prep him as a producer. You provided cards and stuff, but he had a whole technique. You've told me about this, where he didn't want to talk to the people beforehand. There's no guarantee he's sticking to the cards.
He never read his notes. The producers did very diligent notes. Ask this, what about that? Never read the notes before he went on the air.
The Hitchcock interview, I've gone back and watched some of his shows. He starts off the Hitchcock interview by asking him, you know, what scares you? Right. And you think, oh, this is going to be really fascinating. But then Hitchcock says, getting pulled over by the cops. Right. And you're just like, poor Tom, this looks like it's a great avenue. But he could kind of stuck with that and then realized this is going nowhere and then moved on. Right. Would he talk to me about him as a technician of the trade, if you will, and his style of interviewing? Because if you watch that interview and you watch his interview with Charles Manson, I mean, his interview with Manson was brilliant. Yeah. I mean, Manson was crazy and all over the place. Right. You must have marveled at some of his work.
I was constantly amazed at what he was able to pull out of the hat. But as I say, he just wanted a conversation. He didn't want an interview. He wanted a conversation between 2 people. And sometimes it took a while to get to, the end of a story or a point. But he didn't have an agenda at the beginning of the hour. He didn't know where it was going to go. It depended on what the guest said. But no, he was he just loved, as one of the obituaries said after he passed away, he loved the camera and the camera loved him. That's what it was all about. And if an interview was going well, sometimes we would throw out the second guest and just keep going. Sometimes, somebody was over in 5 minutes if it wasn't working. He was a good editor in that regard.
Let's talk about some of the guests. There were some hits and misses. I know, talking to you in the past, Bob Hope was a miss.
Bob Hope was a miss, and it took me a while to figure it out. When we did the show, I thought, oh God, this is awful. But then, strangely enough, years later, when I saw Bob do the Dick Cavett show, Dick Cavett show was with a studio audience, and I realized that the problem with Bob Hope when he was on with us, there was no audience.
So he was a miss, but what are some of the hits that you remember? I mean, we talked a little bit about John Lennon. You had just a laundry list of great names. I mean, Orson Welles, Marlon Brando.
I'll tell you, the Orson Welles was weird. We wanted to get him, and again, we had to clear him. And evidently Johnny didn't want to have him on, so we got him. And we paid, if you were in the union, AFTRA, we paid AFTRA minimum, which is $250. If you were not in AFTRA, just a regular folks, thanks for being here. You know, you get nothing. And if you fly in, we give you a plane and a hotel. So we booked Orson Welles, and then his agent called and he said, listen, I said, I have to be very honest with you. He said, Orson is broke. Can you do any better than $250? And I felt terrible. I mean, this was an embarrassment. But what Orson Welles had offered, he was filming at the time that movie, The Other Side of the Wind, which took him 20 years to film. He was filming it at a studio in Hollywood called Raleigh Studios. And he said, don't worry about lighting. Don't worry about a set. I will light it and I will do the set for you. So based on that, I was able to get him $2,500 that he was saving us, a lighting director and a set decorator. So anyway, he came on and he did the show. And but again, you know, who knew, you know, that he was in those dire straits.
It wasn't just pop culture, social topics, and celebrities. The Tomorrow Show and Tom's new pedigree would at times seep into the programming, as it did with their coverage on Watergate.
I have a story about Martha Mitchell. You know, during the 70s, it was the Watergate era.
Right.
And we had all the Watergate people on. I mean, everybody on who was involved in that episode, including Woodward and Bernstein in their first TV appearance. But what happened is that we had arranged to have Martha Mitchell on. And Martha Mitchell was paranoid because she thought they were trying to kill her. And so she said, well, I will come on, but I don't want it to be announced when we're taping. I don't want it to be announced where I'm staying. And I don't want the video released until I'm back in my apartment in New York. And so, fine, we agreed to that, because that was a good get, as they say, to get Martha Mitchell. So one night, about 3 a.m., my phone rings, and it's the president of NBC. And he said, what the hell is going on with Martha Mitchell? I said, what are you talking about? He said, Martha Mitchell, who was probably drunk, is screaming and yelling that you broke your agreement about her being on the show, and she's seeing promos all over the place for Martha Mitchell. I said, that's not true. We haven't said a word about it. He said, listen, she's driving me crazy. Here's her number. You talk to her and explain what's going on. So here it is in the middle of the night, and I'm, Ms. Mitchell, yeah, I'm the producer. Yes. Why, you broke the, no. Where did you see the promos? On television. Where? What channel? Channel 5. Well, you know, that's the Metro Media and the Fox station. Well, what they had done is to do a Martha Mitchell instant special. They took everything that they had about Martha Mitchell and they made a 1-hour special out of it, and they promoted that Martha Mitchell was going to be on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, whatever it was. And of course, she thought that was us. And I did the best I could. It was the middle of the night. She was drunk, but I tried to explain to her we would never do a thing like that. We will only promo the show 2 weeks before it airs. And we'd given it an air date, hadn't told anybody. So I finally calmed her down. We had arranged for her airline and hotel. And the night of the taping, and we'd sent a limo. She didn't check into the hotel. She didn't take the flight. Of course, you can't do that now. She changed the name on the ticket because she was totally paranoid, and she went to a completely different hotel, and she came over in a cab, and she did the show, and she was wonderful. And she said, they're going to kill me. She said that on the show. And many months later, she was dead.
That's a wild story. So what was the interview like with her? Was she sober?
Yes, she was sober, and she said, you know, Nixon was crazy and her husband was nuts. And I mean, she just let it all out. She hadn't written a book, so this was an opportunity. And of course, Tom knew how to handle her, and it really was a classic interview, just absolutely, and made all the papers the next day.
It's interesting, he had a group of young comedians on one of his shows, and one of the young comedians was David Letterman,
yes.
who would eventually replace him.
Yes,
in that time slot.
that relationship really turned out quite well for Tom.
What was his thoughts about Letterman taking over his slot?
He loved David, and I think David loved him. When Tom was doing his, after he did NBC late night, he did a show on ABC Radio for a number of years, a call-in show. And David would call in using a phony voice to try to get a question to him. It was actually a skit on the Larry Sanders Show that they were going to bring Tom Snyder in to replace somebody behind David. And it actually happened. So, it was very strange the way it all worked out. But no, they got along very, very well. And when Tom passed away, David did a very nice tribute on the air.
The interesting thing is you were there with the show when in its initial stages, but
Right.
in its later iteration, it had a studio audience. Rona Barrett was on it. I mean, it was nothing like what you created, but Roger Ailes was associated with it.
Yes.
I mean, how crazy is it that you worked on that show and then it was Roger Ailes?
So when I left, the producers became the two associate producers. The two associate producers, after a couple of years, moved on. Tom had worked in Philadelphia as a news anchor. In the basement of the studio in Philadelphia, the NBC station, it was a Westinghouse station, was the Mike Douglas show. They taped a very successful syndicated show. And one of the production assistants on the Mike Douglas show was a guy named Roger Ailes. And so Roger and Tom got to be buddies. And so now when the two associate producers left and there were no executive producers, Tom called Roger, who was not doing anything, and said, how'd you like to come over and do this show? And so he was the last executive producer before the show folded. But interestingly enough, and I was not there at the time, but I got complaints from all of the females on the staff of the Tomorrow Show that Roger had come in and immediately propositioned every one of them. So when it later happened that he got in trouble at Fox, it was not a surprise.
In improvisational industry, entertainers, directors, and their producers have always had to think outside the box to keep audiences interested. Though we see production companies constantly seeking to throw out the old and bring in the new, they often find that their moves date back to the early days. This was the world Joel constantly found himself in.
I know that you went to New York with the hosts of that show and did a program, I believe, in the Trump Tower, and somebody came along with perhaps some champagne or caviar.
Yes.
Could you tell that story?
Well, we had decided that they had just built the Trump Tower, and we called up and we said, could we show one of the suites? And they said, of course you could do the suites. So we went in and we were shooting the scene. All of a sudden, here comes Donald Trump. He's got a tray of caviar and champagne, he gives everybody, and then he's just standing there. And he said, when are you going to interview me? He said, well, we're not going to interview. And he took the tray and left. We never got the champagne and caviar.
Thanks so much for sharing all your recollections with
My
us.
pleasure, my pleasure.